Welcome to part 5 of this Peatland ACTION mini-series on how to complete the spatial data template. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to copy data into the template from other sources such as field data or outputs from automated processes. Here is the spatial data template set up in QGIS, and you might recognise that this is the template that's previously been used to demonstrate the bare peat stabilisation layer in Video 3D. Firstly, I'll show you an example of how to copy data from a layer which shares the main columns in the template layer equivalent. Toggling on the template layer example, you'll see that there are many restoration lines saved in this layer. If I open up the attribute table by right-clicking and open attribute table, or alternatively clicking on the attribute table symbol in the top toolbar, then you'll note that many of the columns in this attribute table match those in the template. When you're copying across data from another attribute table, you shouldn't run into any errors if the attribute table that you're copying data from shares the same columns as the attribute table that you're copying data into. At the very minimum, the mandatory columns in the target layer need to be satisfied by the columns within the layer that you're copying the data from. You may notice that there are some additional columns in this example. Whilst this won't trigger any errors when copying and pasting the data, it's worth noting that any data in these columns will be lost during the process. So the first thing that you need to do is select all of the data, and you can do this easily by clicking in the top left hand corner or by clicking on the select all icon in the top of the toolbar of the attribute table. Once all the features are selected, go over to the copy symbol. This is a symbol with two pieces of paper laid over one another, and if you hover over it, it'll say copy selected rows to clipboard, or alternatively you can use Ctrl+C. Copy the data and then open up the attribute table for the restoration lines layer in the template spatial tables group. You want to make this layer editable, so toggle editing mode on by clicking on the pencil in the attribute table. And then to the right you'll see that there's a clipboard icon, and if you hover over it, it'll say paste features from clipboard, or alternatively you can use the shortcut Ctrl+V. Click this icon and the features will start to paste into your new attribute table. No errors have been identified and the data is pasted into the correct columns without any issues. In order to save the layer edits, you need to press the floppy disk symbol at the top of the attribute box. Once all the edits have been saved, you'll see that the FID has been automatically populated for all of the features, and you can now toggle editing off for this layer by clicking the pencil icon. Close down the attribute table and deselect everything using the deselect icon in the top toolbar. Switching off the template example layer by unticking the box to the left of the layer name. Then you can see that all of the lines have been stylized as per the template. And if we expand the restoration lines layer in the spatial tables group, we can see that the majority of lines are HAG reprofiling. So that's an example of pasting in from a layer which shares a similar stable structure to the template, and that's best achieved by packaging the template for a field compatible software such as QField, Avenza or Merging Maps. And take this template out with you onto site in order to populate that before coming back to the desktop study and copying across the data. In the instance that this isn't possible, I'm going to run through your options for copying data across from a layer that doesn't contain any of the same fields as the template layer. So if I turn on this non-template example layer, you'll see there's some more HAGs that have been mapped. Opening the attribute table, you'll note that there's only two columns, an FID and a UID, so none of the mandatory fields within the restoration lines layer have been satisfied by this table. So first it's advised to follow the same steps as previously. Select all of the data and copy it. Open the attribute table for the restoration lines data and toggle editing mode on. Next, paste all the features by clicking on the clipboard icon. A dialog box such as this will appear. Here you can see that the mandatory fields, the site ID and the restoration technique haven't been populated from any of the columns in the source table. The red crosses to the right of these field names show that they need to be completed in order to press the OK button at the bottom left and copy over that feature. When pasting small batches of data, going through the features one by one and selecting the site ID and the technique and pressing OK may be an option. However, in cases like this where there's a large amount of data to copy across, this would be too time consuming. So there are two workaround options. The first is to discard all and the second is to paste all invalid. If you choose to discard all, then no features will be pasted in as per the warning along the top of the QGIS message bar. Then the source layer needs to be updated with the fields required by the target layer, updating information for all of the features prior to copying across. The second, and slightly easier option in my opinion, is to paste all including invalid. So open the attribute table again and paste the data from the clipboard into the table. When the dialog box pops up, instead of completing the fields one by one or discarding all, paste all including invalid. All of the features will then be copied into the layer, and you can see that the geometries appear in the map. If I toggle off my example layer, then all of the features that have just been pasted are mapped using a neon red line, as they are all in the uncategorized group. Open up the Restoration Lines attribute table and you can see that there are 788 new features. Sort on one of the mandatory columns to get all of the new features to the top and then select these. You can choose to show only selected features using the drop-down menu in the bottom left-hand corner. If you were to save the layer edits at this stage and submit this spatial data, then it would fail the QA undertaken by the Data and Evidence team, and we would have to request further amendments were made prior to resubmission. To avoid this, we need to make some updates to the fields that are mandatory in the attribute table, and the easiest way to do this is to use the quick field calculation toolbar at the top of the attribute table. Note that this is only going to be visible when the attribute table is in editing mode, so if I toggle quickly out of editing mode, you can see that that toolbar disappears. The first thing I want to do is update the site ID, and we can see from the background mapping that there's just one site, so this should be updated to 1 for all of the new features. Select the site ID from the drop-down menu to the left and then type 1 into the expression bar in the middle. Ensuring you have the features you want to update selected, you can use the Update Selected option to the right of the Quick Field Calculation toolbar. If you're just trying to update information about specific features, then updating all would overwrite other information. The next mandatory column that needs to be updated is the restoration technique. The restoration technique is an example of a text-constrained restricted value. When you copy and paste data in from another source, you introduce a risk that the restricted values may get overwritten. This creates unnecessarily long processing time for the data team, and particularly poor submissions may be rejected. Using the drop-down, you can see all of the different technique options, however it isn't possible to copy values from here. In order to apply HAG reprofiling to all of the selected features, ensuring that the template restricted value is used, it's recommended to go to the relevant lookup table within the lookup tables group in the GIS template. Expand the lookup tables group and navigate to the appropriate layer. Open the attribute table and find the technique you want, then right-click on the value and copy the cell content. You can then use this copied cell content to make sure that the updates you're carrying out in the other spatial table layers are aligned with the restricted values as per the template. It's worth noting that all of the restricted values are case sensitive, and any changes to things like grammar or gaps in between the values would cause data issues further down the line. Return to your Restoration Lines attribute table, and at the 1, 2, 3 drop-down, go to the restoration technique. Remove the 1 and paste the value HAG reprofiling that you've just copied from the lookup table. For any text updates such as this, single quotation marks are required at either end. And then you can click on the Update Selected button to the right. You'll see this updates all of the features that are currently selected to have a restoration technique of HAG reprofiling. Save the edits. Now both of the mandatory columns, the site ID and the restoration technique, have been updated for all of the features that we pasted in. However, it's important to realise that copying and pasting data in this way introduces a lot of room for human error. The best way to avoid this, as mentioned previously, is to either package up the template before heading out into field, or to try and design your automated outputs to match the mandatory columns and restricted values of the template. In this video, I focused on completing the mandatory fields for the Restoration Lines layer, but please provide additional information such as the average spacing where it's available. It's also important to reference the layer description tables in the guidance PDF within the template pack to ensure that any fields which might be mandatory in certain situations have also been completed, for instance, the material used. There are other videos in this series which will cover how to undertake some self-QA, how to use measurement tables in the Measurement Tables Autocomplete group, and how to digitize your restoration footprint. All of these videos are available on the Nature's Got Peatland ACTION webpage.